It's just human nature. We're always trying to run away from danger.
Mordecai Dex is a musician, producer, songwriter, artist, calligraphist, dancer. He is many things, but he's mostly known as the lead vocalist of Heart the Band, and at least since 2024 a member of Cordon Clan, also a Kenyan band. In addition to the many projects he's been a part of either as a band member or as a solo artist, he's always wanted to create a music album of his own. He mentioned this to me in one of our conversations, since him and I go way back from around 2010, to which I responded by asking or suggesting, what if I paint the album cover? Because I've always wanted to create one of these. And as it turns out, he was just as excited about such a collaboration as I was, and so what you'll be watching today is my process of painting the cover to Mordecai Dex's debut album, Safari. For such a project, it's always best to start by sketching so that I can give the client a number of options to choose from, and I normally boil my ideas down to 3 main options. I'll explain my sketching process in a bit, but just to give you an idea of what the album is about, Safari is a Swahili word for journey. And the songs in the album, and by extension the cover itself, are supposed to depict that concept of movement from one state to another, whether it's from a point in time or a point in space. And so for my first concept, I'd like to have Mordecai sat on a park bench strumming a guitar, which is the main instrument he plays, but then I'll show that feeling of safari or a journey using some elements in the background, as you'll see. When drawing from imagination, as I'll be doing today, I normally start with a very simple stick figure. I tend to draw with a lot of lines until I find the one that sticks, no pun intended. Then afterwards I draw my figures as though they are quite muscular. This applies to both male and female adult characters that I'm drawing. Then if I'd like for them to be skinny or fat or add other variations, I'll make those adjustments afterwards. The advantage of having a good understanding not only of the proportions of the human skeleton, but also the way muscles connect and the way they wrap around the bones, is that it enables me to almost accurately imagine the way the skin would then cover those muscles, so that when I'm done sketching, my characters won't look stiff or wooden. Without this knowledge, then all these bumps and folds in the skin would simply boil down to guesswork. After roughly painting what the naked figure would probably look like, in not so much detail because the figure will be covered anyway, I then reduce the opacity, then start drawing the clothes on top of the figure. This is similar to the approach I've just used, by starting with the main muscles, then drawing the skin on top. And so in the same way, I'm able to tell how exactly the clothes will wrap around the character. It looks like a long process, starting with the stick figure or the skeleton, then the muscles on top of that, then the skin on top of that, then the clothes on top of that. But at least for me, it's the way that normally gets me the best results, as opposed to, say, if I started drawing this character clothed from the word go. I would have spent so much time fixing mistakes because I wouldn't have a way to know what's underneath the clothes or what bones or muscles they're supposed to be hugging or wrapping around. There are artists who can paint clothed figures very easily from the word go, but I am just not one of them. You'll notice that with each layer that I draw, I reduce the opacity of the previous one. It's the previous layer that guides whatever the current layer is, and so with each successive layer, the lines I'm using get more and more crisp and less confused. The sketch is not 100% perfect, even the proportions aren't nail-on perfect, but their job, at least when I sketch, is normally to show the client or to show my models how I'd like for them to pose. And so as long as I depict the action I want them to do, or the way I'd like for them to twist their body or to turn or to hold something, like in this case a guitar, then my work is done. I don't obsess over a lot of detail in this stage. That will be a problem for the second half of the video when I actually start painting. Mordecai has quite long dreadlocks, but for the concepts I have for this album cover, I'd like for him to tie them up in the way I've described here, so that his face isn't hidden. The layer that I'm drawing here is going to be the last one for this sketch. I don't normally do any hatching or cross-hatching or shading in my sketches, or rather I haven't had a reason to do that yet, and so the entire point of this stage in my process is normally to just describe the pose. The extent I go to when showing the direction of light in my sketches is just to use an arrow, maybe to indicate where I'd like the light source to be, which is normally very useful in the photoshoot, which is going to be the next step, but I've never really felt the need to draw every shadow in this stage. There's some areas of the human body I still kind of struggle with, like his jaw, for instance, looks a bit too boxy in this sketch, but that's more of a general problem I have, and not because I'm trying to draw Mordecai here. I'm not aiming for likeness, so the sketches won't look like Mordecai himself, but they look like somebody holding a guitar. There are of course a few other things that also don't look perfect, like the hands maybe look a bit too small, but with practice, sketches tend to get more and more perfect. So this is something that I won't obsess with, at least in this exercise, but naturally with each painting I do that requires such a process, I kind of perfect these proportions more and more. So for some of these things, it's just all about mileage. Most of my paintings didn't require such a process because I used to just paint from existing photographs, and a lot of them were portraits. So at least up until 2022, there was something like a 10-year period where I just didn't sketch anything. But lately, as my paintings have gotten more and more complex, I've had to sort of refresh my drawing skills and learn anatomy from scratch again, which I have to say has been such a fun process, and my working method has also gotten more engaging and challenging and more fulfilling this way as opposed to how it was before. The app I'm using to draw here is Photoshop. As far as apps go, Photoshop has to be my best friend. I sketch and design and plan nearly everything I do on there before moving to Canvas because I feel like it speeds up the process a bit more, especially for something like sketching, where it makes it possible for me to say delete these layers that I won't need now just by one click, as opposed to if I had to erase them all on paper. Not that I can't do that, I just don't feel the need to. This is a preparatory step in the painting process, and so I'm going to try to make sure it doesn't take up more time than it actually needs. In any case, after drawing the figure, I'll then draw the landscape behind him. And in the sketch, this is imaginary, but of course later on, if this is the concept that we choose to go with, I'll find a landscape that best fits the lighting we'll use in the photoshoot. For this concept, I'd like to use the sky to show that feeling of motion or safari or journey. And so the landscape is going to stay realistic, but then I can use the sky to show that feeling in a surrealistic fashion. So now we have our scene, and you can see how clean it looks now that I've gotten rid of all the guidelines I was using earlier. And so the next step will of course be to trim it or crop it into something like a square, because that's the shape that album covers take. And then in this case, I'll section the sky into 3, and then I could paint different weather conditions in each part to give that feeling of safari. But in this case, it's a journey from a dull grey sky to a blue sky or a sunny day in the middle to a cloudy or a rainy sky to the right. And through all that, Mordecai will be strumming his guitar. Then of course, across that sectioned sky, we can then add the album title and the artist's name as well. And with that, the first sketch is ready. For sketch number 2, I'm gonna try and go for something a bit more dynamic. The concept here is to try and kill the symmetry that I can see in sketch number 1, whereby even though it looks calm and settled, and of course Mordecai is sat right at the center, both the left and the right side of the painting look a bit too similar. Of course, we have the crossed legs and the guitar itself that kind of kill the symmetry, which I'm also replicating in sketch number 2. But because of the general symmetry, sketch number 1 looks a bit serious and disciplined, so I'm going to try and change that in the second idea. This time I'll have the model sat facing something of a 3/4 angle to us, whereby his body isn't directly facing the camera. So maybe just by changing that aspect, we'll introduce a bit of action, even though I still want him to look kind of chilled and reflective. I'm basically trying to not make it boring. And one way to do that is to make the pose a bit asymmetrical and incongruent. Same drawing process as before, where I start with the stick figure, then I connect different muscles and some skin on top of it. You don't need to know all the muscles like on a medical level to be able to do this. Just an average understanding of the main muscles or the large muscles in the body are sufficient when it comes to drawing human figures. I'm also in a bit of a tight spot when it comes to learning how to draw human figures, because I'm a bit squeamish and I can't really look at something like a dissected body, for instance, the way medical students do. And so I haven't actually dug deep into, say, the way each of these muscles work in detail. But as you can see, with a relatively shallow knowledge of the basic mechanism of the muscular system, I'm still able to draw figures that look kind of believable. By now, of course, I've reduced the opacity of the earlier layer, and of course the skeleton or the stick figure that I started with is barely visible now, and so now I can start clothing the figure once again. At this point I realize I may have messed up the angle of his right leg, because if his legs are folded this way, then we shouldn't be able to see his entire calf the way it shows, so apologies for that. I'm not very creative when it comes to footwear, so I'm gonna give him boots once again, except this time I'll just get rid of the laces so they look kind of different, but it's more or less the same boots as in sketch number 1. Here you can see the big advantage of drawing the figure naked first, because since I drew his feet bare, I can start by drawing the soles of his shoes before drawing the shoe itself. If I didn't have the naked foot to wrap the sole and the rest of the shoe around, then I'd have to guess where the shoe would go, and so we would end up with shoes that look like they're higher than they're supposed to be or bigger than they're supposed to be, and so on. Of course, in each layer there's more and more adjustments and corrections that I keep making. So for instance, his face looks bigger than it's supposed to be, so in this new layer I'm giving him a new face. And since the rest of the drawing doesn't look too bad, I'll also make this the final layer. Now for this concept, since he's looking up, I could actually release his locks since they won't cover his face anyway. But I'll just sketch it this way. Then in the photoshoot we'll probably try both options with the locks either loosened or tied into a bun. I'm happier with the way these hands look than the ones in sketch number 1, and that's mostly because of the way the fingers are placed. When certain fingers are doing their own thing, like in this case you can see in his right hand the pinky finger is on its own, and the thumb of course naturally also is, but then the other 3 are kind of stuck together. But then in his left hand both the pinky and the forefinger are separate from the others, and that way I think the hands look a bit more active in this sketch than they did before. But again, these are minor problems because when we'll be shooting, Mordecai will be strumming, so the fingers will do whatever they want anyway in any pose. The way the cloth folds is determined first by the muscles underneath, and of course by the other things that may be pressing against it, like maybe in this case the guitar or the chair. All those need to be taken into consideration when deciding where you're going to have the creases in such a sketch. So even though I'm not showing the drapery in detail, I'm trying to not create these creases at random. I still want everything to look as natural as I can make it. There are also a few minor details I try to think about, like for instance, since his leg is at a bit of an angle, the boot is also going to fold right above his ankle, and for the same reason the front part of his pant legs will be slightly raised. In the first sketch, I showed that feeling of movement or that feeling of safari or the journey using the sky. This time I'll try to depict it using the ground. And I can do that by sectioning this ground into 3 parts. And then I'll try and show different seasons or weather conditions by making it look like something of a transition from a time when the land is dry to when it's fertile. Then since the sky will be empty this time, or at least not sectioned this way, the album title and Mordecai's name can go there. I think that does it for sketch number 2. And for the third idea, I'm going to try and combine the first 2 in terms of trying to show that feeling of movement or safari using both the sky and the ground. I'll be setting this scene on some train tracks. I could have used a road, but since tarmac roads are flat, it wouldn't have the kind of character that you find on a railway. And it could also make for something of a plain or a boring scene, which is what I'm trying to avoid for these last 2 concepts. And so this time I'll start by painting the landscape, then I'll use that to decide where I'd like to place Mordecai. I'm using 3 reference images for the tracks and the landscape, and this will also inform how we light the scene when shooting. After roughly indicating where I'd like the model to sit or how tall I'd like him to be in relation to the rails, I'll then hide the layer on which I painted the landscape so that I'll be able to focus on drawing the model without having that distraction behind. Just like in sketch number 2, this pose also doesn't have any symmetry in it. That's because the model is not facing us directly, and so I think automatically the scene looks a bit more exciting than in the first idea. Just to give a brief explainer on how I come up with these stick figures that I start with, I simplify the skeleton into 3 main shapes or ovals, one for the skull, one for the ribs, and one for the pelvis. Of course, to do this accurately, it helps to first know the proportions of a real skeleton or a real human being, so that even in such a simplified form, the proportions look believable, and so they can guide me and help me to paint figures that also look not too far removed from natural proportions. The arms and legs are simplified as sticks, then of course the hands and feet also become little ovals or trapeziums, as the case may be. As I go along, I also adjust the stick figure itself, and sometimes I do it so much that by the time I'm done with the character, its pose only vaguely resembles the stick figure that I started with. But in any case, it's still a good and reliable starting point. An immediate case in point here is the hands in this figure look a bit too stiff, so I may have to draw them again later on. When drawing legs in poses where one leg is hidden behind the other, it helps to start by drawing both butt cheeks individually, even though you can't see them obviously. But starting the legs from that point leads to more accurate proportions, as opposed to if I just started from the point where the thigh becomes visible. That's probably the thing I should have done a bit more carefully in the second sketch, then maybe I wouldn't have struggled with that right leg so much. Each drawing presents its own challenges, of course, and for this one, it's clear to me, for instance, that the hands will have to go. So far, it looks like a very uncomfortable pose, and so as soon as I'm done with the legs, I'll perform a digital amputation on my character's arms, then start over. And to get the hand and arm positions to look a bit more natural and comfortable, I think it will help to start by drawing the guitar this time. So it will be like someone has placed the guitar on his lap, then we'll somehow get into his mind and try to figure out how he would hold it. And for this, I'll start by indicating where the hands themselves will be. So one of them will be strumming near the sound hole and the other one will be holding the neck. I'll then draw a few rough lines to figure out how the hands will probably curve. Then halfway through that line, I'll find an elbow and have my stick figure once again. Then I can get rid of the guitar and start painting the hands again for the second time, this time with a bit more promise. I don't play the guitar myself, so I actually don't know if this is a comfortable position to be playing one in, but at least visually it looks like it can work. That said, I'll only use it if in the photoshoot it turns out that it's actually doable. Sometimes it's possible to get carried away when sketching, so most of the times these sketches only end up being something like suggestions, but then on site we can adjust them with the model to find what actually works and what's comfortable. Next up, I'll draw the model in the final layer, then afterwards I'll reintroduce the landscape that I started with and complete the sketch. With the train tracks, it's of course a similar process to the way I've just drawn the model, but I'm drawing it on a different layer so it will be easy for me to erase the parts that will be hidden behind the model. And so when I combine that feeling of perspective, where you feel like you can almost walk from where the model is sitting to the horizon, where the tracks seem to converge in the background, with a sky that also shows that feeling of movement, albeit in time, I think that concept of safari or a journey will be well highlighted in this approach as well. The sky is sectioned into a night sky on the far left, then the sky just before dawn in the middle, and finally to the right we could have either a sunny day shown by a blue sky or a sunrise. The album title in this concept takes up the bottom third of the frame, and so after adding it to the sketch we now have ourselves the three ideas that will guide us in the next stage of the process, which is going to be the photoshoot. Photoshoots are normally one of the most exciting parts of my painting process because this is the stage where I not only get to see if the ideas I was imagining can actually work in practice, but I also get to collaborate and work with people who are also experts in their fields, be they models or photographers. And so they'll normally start with me explaining my concept to everyone involved. Like in this case, we have Mordecai and Bill or Kenya Library, who's the photographer that's going to be helping me with the general setup and lighting. And of course, it also includes some fun moments where sometimes I have to act out what I'm trying to get the model to do. They can take some time because sometimes there can be makeup involved or some costume changes. But all in all, it's always one of the most enjoyable parts of the process because it's the time when the project starts to come to fruition because you get to see the photos for the first time and the scenes come to life. And so after a couple of hours of shooting, I now have myself over 200 pictures to sort through. And by trying them out alongside the sketches, find out which one will best represent the spirit of the album as well as create the best artwork, visually speaking. The painting process will start with me destroying one of my old paintings, but it's not really a painting, it's more of a trial painting where I was just testing out a certain technique that didn't work, so it's totally expendable. I'm going to start by covering it with an acrylic background, which will dry in no time, and so I'll be able to use chalk to draw the grids on it that will guide the outline stage. As for the grid itself, I'll add smaller rectangles in the sections where I'll have, say, Mordecai's face or hands, or other critical sections where accuracy matters more. Of course, eventually I'll be trying to achieve this throughout the painting, but whereas I can make up some details in, say, how the clouds in the background will look or how some rocks will look, I don't have, or at least I don't give myself the luxury of doing that when it comes to human figures. And so that's why in some sections, these smaller grids will show up. I'm painting the outlines using oil paints, but oil paints that's been mixed with a lot of solvent. The solvent I'm using here is terpenoid, which is a non-toxic alternative to kerosene, or rather kerosene is its toxic alternative that I sometimes use, but of course with proper aeration in my studio. And what the solvent does is it increases the viscosity of the paint so that it becomes fluid enough that I can use it to draw these lines that look like they could have been drawn with a pen. And by now I bet you can already tell which sketch or which idea I decided to go with for the painting. You may remember I had sectioned the sky in the third sketch into 3 parts, and since the part to the left is supposed to show a night sky, I'll start by painting the dark vastness of space first, because I intend to draw stars on it, and I won't be able to do this if that dark or that black sky isn't fully dry. And so even before I'm done with the outlines, I'll start by mixing the colors that will give me that dark sky. I don't normally use black in its pure form in my paintings, and so the color to the left of the palette, which is a mixture of Van Dyke brown and Mars black, is going to act as the darkest color in the sections of the painting that normally would have appeared black. I won't make the night sky pitch black since I think that will make it dominate the painting in a way that will probably be distracting, and so the 3 shades of grey next to the darkest color on the palette will have to suffice. The masking tape, which I'm going to use quite a lot in this painting, is only there to prevent the paint from quote-unquote spilling over to the other section. And so after laying the colors next to each other and blending them into a smooth transition, I'll resume painting the outlines. Then later on I'll get rid of the grids and continue working on the sky once again. brush that I'm using to erase the chalk grid is filled with water, and this enables it to rub off the chalk underneath without interfering with the oil paints, because oil and water are not miscible. Since I don't want to be too careful around the edges or the borders between two sections when I'm painting the sky, for instance, covering the section that I want to protect with masking tape saves me the hassle, and so this way I can be quote-unquote carefree with my brush, so that the outermost edges of this section won't look too dissimilar to the inner parts, which is what would have happened if I had tried to carefully paint them in a straight line instead. The blue sky here, just like the night sky before, is also a transition between different colors, since this not only enhances that feeling of distance in a way that a plain blue sky probably wouldn't, but it also aligns with the direction of the light. So in this case, the sun is somewhere towards the bottom of this frame. It would be easier to paint the clouds when the sky is fully dry, but I can get around that by using very soft brushes which simply won't damage or smudge the paint underneath. The option to wait for it to dry doesn't work in this case, because bright oil paints such as the ones I've used for the sky take at least 5 days to dry. By this time, the dark expanse or vastness that I started with for the night sky is fully dry, so I'll be able to paint the stars without worrying about their color mixing with that of the darkness around and behind them. I also figured early enough that I'd need to rest my hand on the canvas in this part when painting the stars, which is something I didn't need to do for the clouds in the other section. And so for that reason as well, this part had to be dry before this step. The stars are at different distances from the earth, and some are brighter than others, and so I'm also trying to depict that using different tints. The final sky that I'll paint is of course the morning sky, which in this painting acts as a bridge between the night on the left and the day to the right. It's also the most colorful of the three, since at this time, just like at sunset, the sun is normally at the lowest point in the horizon, and so the longer wavelengths like red, orange and yellow reach our eyes in a way they normally can't when the sun is higher up, and so as a result we have this vibrant and kind of fiery scene. Lastly, I'll paint with two simple dots, the two planets that can be visible at this time, so we have Venus and Jupiter right above it. When the masking tape comes off, it picks with it and therefore damages some of the paint in the light blue section of the sky since it hasn't dried yet, and so I'll use a soft brush to kind of fill up those sections in which the paint has been removed. I'll generally be painting this scene starting from the background to where we the viewers are, and so after the sky, the plants behind Mordecai and the railway will take center stage. I'm first painting the shrubbery as a dark silhouette, then just like I did with the night sky, I'll let that section dry, then move on to paint the railway, after which I'll come back and finish it later on. I'm painting these dots to show me where each slipper ends, since the most convenient way to paint this railway will be to start by covering the entire section between the rails with the darkest color of the shadows. Then later on I'll connect the dots or the lines that I'm using as markers to paint the slippers. The slippers are these long rectangular pieces of timber or concrete or even steel that are laid at equal distances across the rails. I'm doing this freehand, so of course the lines won't be geometrically perfect, but the trick to try and get them as close to perfection as possible is to actually paint them quickly. I find that when I'm too careful with lines, my hands start to shake, and so as a result I tend to end up drawing lines that are a bit too wiggly. In any case, I'll come back and fix some of the more obvious imperfections in these lines anyway. Now that I'm painting the upper section of the slippers, I can use bigger brushes, and of course now you can see how much easier this is as opposed to if I was painting each slipper then painting each shadowed section individually before moving on to the next one. And for those bright sections at the top, I start by painting something of a neutral color, then showing the most brightly lit sections afterwards. As I've been working on this railway, or at least the section behind Mordecai, the silhouette of the plants in the background has been drying, and so I can now move on to it and using different shades of green indicate the various plants that make up this imaginary scene. I'll also use the colors that I painted the night sky with to kind of poke holes in that silhouette so it appears the sky is visible behind the foliage. I've added a cliff with some vegetation behind it or on it to the right of our railway line so that this place appears as though it's something of an escarpment. In this section I'll jump between the ground, the rails and the sleepers depending on what's behind or above what else, since if I start with some elements before others it can be difficult to paint the others afterwards. My process is calculated to ensure maximum efficiency and as little damage to the painted sections as possible. And so in this case, for instance, I decided to focus on painting the cliff while the ground was drying, so that by the time I'm placing the masking tape here to paint the rails, removing it afterwards won't damage the ground. I'm going to paint the sleepers around and in front of Mordecai as well, so that when I'll be painting him, his clothes will quote-unquote cut through the sleepers, or at least through the one on which I've sat him. The sleepers that are close to us are big enough that I can paint them individually, and so I no longer need to cover the entire section in shadow as I did for the ones behind Mordecai and into the distance. I'm also using multiple brushes here to create different effects and different colors as well to show the bumps, deteriorations, imperfections and that upon close inspection, which you can afford since we are now very close to these particular sleepers, can be observed. Since the camera in this scene will be focused on Mordecai, I'll use soft brushes to blur the two sleepers that are closest to us. After this, I'll paint the rail that's on top of them with the same process that I used for the one to the right. And of course, I'm doing this after the sleepers are dry, so don't let the quick cuts fool you. This is all done over a period of a couple of days at least. With all the surrounding elements, namely the sky, the trees and shrubs in the middle ground, the railway and the cliff to the side complete, I can now focus my attention on the main character. When it comes to the face, I'm starting by painting the outlines afresh using a smaller brush, as this would give me better accuracy than I was able to achieve with the outlines at the very beginning of the painting. I'll then fill up the sections in the background in which I may have made slight mistakes in, after which I'll start painting the model. In my palette, I've arranged all the colors that I'm going to use for the face and for other parts of exposed skin in an array that flows from dark to light. And so here I'm starting with the darkest shadows or the darkest areas first. And remember, as dark as it looks, this color isn't black because I mixed it with quite a sizable portion of Van Dyke brown. Still on the shadows, I'll then paint the next darkest color that's visible. And this will be something close to burnt umber. The next shadow will be slightly lighter, and this is close to burnt sienna. And as you can see, just these three alone give a pretty good indication of what the character's features look like. After the main shadows, I then skip to the other side of the palette and start painting the brightest sections or the highlights. I'll do this in two tints, then fill the remaining spaces with the mid-tone. With these 6 colors laid down, pretty much all the intricacies of light and shadow on the face are covered, and so the next step will be to blend them all in to make it look less like a vector painting with all these sharp edges between different colors, so that the colors can smoothly flow into one another and the borders are not discernible. I'll then use even smaller brushes to paint in the finer details, like the way his mustache catches the light, or some individual strands of hair that are visible with this kind of lighting. Of course, without forgetting the chain, since ornaments are quite a distinctive feature in the way Mordecai and other members of the band style themselves. It's going to be the same process for the suit, except now the only difference is that we'll be using blues and purples instead of browns. And I'm painting the suit before the guitar because it's behind it, in the same way that Mordecai's face and neck was somehow behind the suit. I'm going to be using this approach in painting all the remaining sections, since it can be quite complicated to figure out what to start with a pose that has this many complexities. You'll notice that every time I'm using masking tape to block out one section, I'm cutting out the unwanted section with a blade. This isn't damaging the rest of the painting, since for one I'm using a very sharp blade and so I don't need to use too much force. And secondly, because the heavy acrylic layer that I started with protects the back of the painting or the back of the canvas board. And so there's pretty much no chance of me, say, punching a hole on the canvas or tearing any part of it. And so with the entire neck of the guitar blocked out or protected in this way, I'll paint the rest of the suit, or at least the parts that are around the guitar. I won't paint the rest of his right leg right now, since I'll need to rest my hand on that section while I paint the guitar and the right arm. And so after only covering the section of his thigh where the soundboard is resting, I'll then get to do the masking tape and place new ones on there that will protect the surrounding while I paint the fretboard. The section surrounding the fretboard or the neck of the guitar is completely dry by the time I'm doing this. And so to clarify once again, despite what it looks like, I haven't done all this in one sitting. I've replaced the smeared masking tapes with new cleaner strips, on top of which I can calibrate the sections where I'd like to draw the individual frets. So these are the lines or the spaces between the lines that are going to be running along the neck of the guitar. And you may recall this is the exact same method I used when I was painting the slippers in the railway line just behind our main character. Anyway, next up I'll use some simple dots to paint the inlays or the position markers that the guitarist normally uses to quickly locate the chords on the fretboard. The sound hole is mostly dark since barely any light makes it in there, and so painting it is a much simpler affair. The soundboard has two main colors, black and orange, and so I'll blend this in while carefully trying to avoid painting over the section where the strumming hand will be. Of course, Mordecai's hand will cast a bit of shadow on it, so I'll indicate that as well, after which I'll paint the bridge, the saddle, and the rest of the details that make up this part of the guitar. With this part of the guitar done, now is the right time to paint the right hand. Since it's on top of the guitar, at least visually in terms of how I'll paint it, the advantage of having started with what's behind, or in this case the guitar, is that the edges of the hand will kind of eat into or slice through the colors of the guitar behind, and so that illusion of distance whereby the hand is in front of the guitar will be more believable that way. I'm painting it using the same process to how I painted his face, after which I'll also paint the remaining parts of exposed skin, which in this case is the left hand and the shin. What will be left after this is the socks, the shoes, and the rest of the suit. By now you must have a pretty good idea of the way I'm approaching these sections, and so to avoid a lot of repetition, I will catch you at the end of this stage. took a bit of time off screen to paint the remaining parts of the guitar, namely the strings, the string posts and the tuning heads. And so in this stage I'm just applying a bit of highlights on them, and then the painting will be pretty much done. And even though I'm done with the painting itself, there's one vital step that has to be taken so it can become presentable. You'll notice that in some parts it's more reflective than others, and it also has sections that appear kind of dull. These have to be harmonized so the whole surface looks uniform, otherwise it will show some ugly reflections when placed under a light. And so the next step here is to varnish it. I'm applying a layer of matte varnish, which as I apply it looks very reflective, but after drying for about half an hour, it will take on a uniformly matte or non-reflective luster. And so with the dull patches completely wiped out, the painting can now be appreciated in any kind of light from any given direction without the kind of damaging inconsistency that was visible earlier on its surface. While this concludes the painting process, there's one small but very important task that's left to be done, and that's turning it into an album cover. I mentioned earlier that Mordecai is, amongst other things, a calligraphist, and in preparation for this painting, he had sent me, or rather, he gifted me a few sheets of paper on which he had written some text in his calligraphic font. Since this is what I like to use to create the text for his album title, I'll scan one of these, open it on Photoshop, then I'll slowly rearrange the text so that it all flows from left to right. Since he wrote all this himself, the letters are not 100% similar, and so I'm doing this so I can pick from different words in this page the letters in the word safari that I quote-unquote like the most. But to do that, I'll first draw them afresh so I have my own layer. And these are the ones I'll transfer over to a different section of the page, from which I'll use a couple of straight lines to adjust them in trying to iron out the few imperfections that can be expected of human handwriting. I'll then copy this text onto a picture of the painting itself, after which I'll do the same thing again, but this time with even cleaner and more geometrically accurate lines, at least the straight ones. And I'm doing this because my hand was a bit shaky when I was copying it in the first attempt earlier on, and so this time the curves are a bit cleaner. And so the first ones I used are simply acting as guides. I don't want the title to be at the top of the cover, since that will cut through the different skies we have, and so after this I'll move it to the lower section, whereby I'll color it brightly so it stands out. Then I'll rasterize that layer and give it something of a drop shadow so it pops out from the surface. I'm using a different font for Mordecai's name and the album subtitle, but I'll color Mordecai's name in the same orange that's in the guitar soundboard, and the Journey of a Thousand Songs subtitle in the light blue color of the sky. I'll then use a soft brush to paint a vignette at the bottom, then reduce its opacity so the railway is still visible underneath. The final step will be to crop the image into a square, and with this we now have ourselves an album cover. And with my work here pretty much done, now it's time to introduce you to yet another happy client.
Oh my goodness. Buddha! Hey, cheki wazejo. Wow. Wow. Napenda pia picha yenye mchuzi. The picture you chose.
As picha moja ni combine.
So we combine like different.
Totally from one picture, we got it from another.
Are you serious? Who does that? Ulikuwa meant kufanya hii. Ulikuwa meant kufanya hii shughuli kwa hivyo yako kabisa. Yes.
Something really cool happened with this painting that I didn't see coming, and that is in the music videos for the songs in Safari, this painting actually makes a cameo here and there, which is such a nice way for the whole project to come full circle. I was really happy to see that. I'm going to link Mordecai's album and his pages in the description to this video and the YouTube playlist for the music videos as well. So please check it out and enjoy the music through which Mordecai's talent speaks for itself. I hope you found this entertaining or informative, and in case you might have any questions about the process, feel free to leave them in the comment section. Thanks for your time, and I'll see you in the next one.